The crowd roared as the heavy iron gates creaked open. Out stepped a man, nearly naked except for a simple cloth tied around his waist. His body shook with fear, and the bright sun above felt almost blinding as it hit his skin. The ground beneath him was covered in sand, darkened with old stains of dried blood from those who had fallen before him. From the far side of the massive Colosseum, another gate rattled open, and a huge lion leapt out, its hungry eyes instantly locking on its new victim. High above, in the emperor's special seat, the ruler lifted his hand, then dropped it like a signal. The fight for survival had begun. Scenes like this happened thousands of times in ancient Rome. What started as punishments for criminals soon became shows for the public, something people came to crave just like food. A Roman poet once said that the people only wanted bread and circuses, meaning free food and bloody entertainment. To Romans, executions weren't just about justice. They were a kind of theater, a thrilling event that was part of everyday life. While today we find such spectacles horrifying, Romans saw them as both a duty and a pleasure. Even the philosopher Seneca admitted that after watching these games, he left feeling more greedy, more cruel, and less human, yet he, like countless others, kept going back for more. The emperors made sure the games never lost their excitement. Augustus set aside special days just for these events, and by the 4th century, more than a third of the year, over 135 days, was dedicated to public shows. When the Colosseum opened in 80 CE under Emperor Titus, the celebration lasted 100 straight days. The schedule was carefully planned: lighter shows in the morning, public executions at midday, and gladiator battles in the afternoon. It was a full day of death and bloodshed, packaged as entertainment. One of the most infamous forms of execution was condemnation to the beasts. This brutal punishment, usually reserved for slaves, prisoners of war, and serious criminals, turned death into a grand performance. The Colosseum, with its capacity of 50,000 people and a maze of underground tunnels, was designed to heighten the drama. Trapdoors allowed animals to spring up from hidden chambers, creating shocking, almost magical entrances. During the grand opening, the historian Cassius Dio wrote that 9,000 animals and countless prisoners were slaughtered in carefully staged scenes. Executions often doubled as live retellings of myths. A condemned man might be dressed as Icarus and thrown to the beasts, or as Hercules forced to fight a lion without weapons. Nero, in particular, enjoyed these twisted performances. Once, he forced a man to play Daedalus by strapping fake wings to his arms and pushing him from a great height. The man fell to his death, his blood splattering near the emperor's seat. In another spectacle, Nero made a man act as Orpheus, sending him into the arena with a lyre, as if his music might tame the wild animals. For a moment, the beast seemed calm, but then they tore him apart, turning myth into a cruel joke. Roman writers often praised these gruesome shows. One even said, "What was once just a story on stage becomes real in our arena." The scale of animal killings in Rome's arenas was almost unbelievable. When Emperor Trajan celebrated his great victories in 107 CE, he threw games that went on for 123 days straight. During that time, around 11,000 animals were slaughtered, along with thousands of criminals and prisoners of war. For the Romans, this wasn't just punishment, it was entertainment. The poet Martial even wrote about a female prisoner who was forced to act out the myth of Pasiphae, the woman who loved a bull. But instead of a staged play, she was torn apart by a savage bear while the crowd roared with approval. To them, cruelty wasn't shocking, it was thrilling. To keep up with these bloody shows, Rome needed a constant supply of exotic animals. Hunters called venatores traveled across the empire, from the thick forests of Germany to the hot deserts of Africa to capture lions, leopards, elephants, ostriches, and anything else that could make the games more spectacular. One of the Most elaborate displays happened under Emperor Probus in the 3rd century. In the Circus Maximus, he had an artificial hill built in the middle of the arena and planted it with real trees. Then he filled it with 100 ostriches, 100 stags, 100 wild boars, and countless other animals. Condemned prisoners were sent in to hunt them, promised freedom if they survived. Of course, almost none did. But it wasn't only animals. Fire also became a tool of punishment and spectacle. Burning alive, which the Romans called vivicumburium, was seen as both a punishment and a purification for terrible crimes. Arsonists were burned as a kind of poetic justice, and even Vestal virgins who broke their vows of chastity could face this horrifying fate. One of the most famous victims was Cornelia, a Vestal virgin executed in 91 CE under Emperor Domitian. Though she pleaded her innocence, she was led away with dignity to her death, crying out that the emperor himself had triumphed thanks to her prayers. Emperor Nero, however, turned burning people into something far worse, a kind of twisted performance. Art. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, he accused Christians of starting it and began killing them in the most gruesome ways. Some were covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were nailed to crosses. Many were coated in wax or pitch, set on fire, and used as human torches to light Nero's gardens at night. Imagine the scene. As men and women screamed. In flames, Nero drove his chariot among them, pretending to be both the ruler of the games and the star performer. Even in a society used to violence, this went too far. The historian Tacitus wrote that people pitied the Christians, not because everyone believed they were innocent, but because it was clear they were dying for one man's cruelty rather than for the good of Rome. Ironically, the place where these burnings took place, Nero's gardens on Vatican Hill, would later become the site of St. Peter's Basilica, heart of Christianity after Emperor Constantine's conversion. Rome's cruelty wasn't limited to civilians. The army had its own terrifying punishments to keep soldiers in line. One of the harshest was fustuarium, being beaten to death by your fellow soldiers. This happened if a man deserted, lost his weapon, or showed cowardice in battle. The condemned soldier would be surrounded by his comrades, who would strike him with clubs and stones until he died. The military writer Vegetius said this punishment was so terrifying that soldiers preferred facing death on the battlefield to facing certain death at the hands of their own brothers in arms. For Rome, even, discipline was turned into a public show of fear and violence. For the Romans, the line between theater, justice, and bloodshed was blurred. What was a nightmare for the condemned was, for the crowd, the ultimate entertainment. In the Roman army, punishment wasn't just about discipline, it was about fear, shame, and spectacle. One of the harshest punishments was called fustuarium, and it was taken so seriously that some soldiers even chose it for themselves when they felt they had failed their brothers in arms. Rather than live with disgrace, they saw this brutal death as an honorable way out. Here's how it worked. A Roman officer, called a tribune, would lightly tap the condemned soldier with a staff. That single touch was the signal. Immediately, the other soldiers would rush in with clubs and stones, beating the man to death right there in camp. If by some miracle he escaped, it didn't matter. He couldn't go home, and his own family would refuse to take him in. In Rome, shame followed you everywhere, even beyond the battlefield. The public nature of the punishment was the point. Everyone had to watch, to feel the fear of what could happen if they failed. During the Second Punic War, when Hannibal's army nearly broke Rome, the consul Titus Ceronius Gracchus ordered a fustuarium for an entire unit of 4,000 men who had fled in panic. In the end, it was reduced to decimation, killing one man out of every 10, but even that showed the limits of such brutality when applied to thousands at once. Rome used punishment as a weapon not just against enemies, but also against its own. After Spartacus' slave rebellion was crushed in 71 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus made the survivors pay a terrible price. Many were crucified along the Appian Way, while others were beaten to death in public with clubs. The message was simple: Rome's power was absolute, both outside and inside its borders. Some Roman generals even turned punishment into theater. Pompey, known for his flair, once had repeat thieves executed not with ordinary clubs, but with the staffs of military standards, the sacred emblems of Rome's honor. Imagine the scene: the very symbols of pride and victory now twisted into tools of shame and death, while the whole army looked on. But the Romans didn't stop there. They invented punishments that were both terrifying and spectacular. One was pulveratio, being crushed by stones. Sometimes the stones were piled slowly to make the suffering last longer. For truly shocking crimes, like murdering your own family, the condemned might face something even worse. In one notorious case, a man guilty of killing his father was sewn into a sack with a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake. Then the sack was crushed under stones, ensuring not only his body was destroyed, but also that his soul was denied a proper burial. To Romans, this meant total obliteration, no peace in death, no memory to mourn. Perhaps the most dramatic form of crushing came with elephants. After Rome defeated King Pyrrhus in the 3rd century BC, they captured his war elephants and found new uses for them. No longer just weapons of battle, elephants became executioners. Deserters and prisoners of war were thrown into arenas, where trained elephants crushed them underfoot as crowds cheered. These beasts weren't just wild animals, they were trained killers. Writers like Pliny the Elder even described how elephants could be taught to crush a man one limb at a time, dragging out the execution for maximum horror. The spectacle reached its peak during the Punic Wars. Captured Carthaginian generals, who had once commanded elephants in battle, were forced to die beneath the very creatures they once led. It was not just punishment, it was revenge, humiliation, and entertainment all rolled into one. For Rome, violence wasn't just about killing, it was ritual, performance, and control. Every soldier, every slave, and every enemy learned the same lesson: Rome's power was inescapable, and even death itself could be turned into a show. Some Roman executions were staged almost like battle reenactments. According to the writer Valerius Maximus, prisoners were sometimes dressed in enemy armor and then sent into the arena with war elephants. These elephants had been trained in real battles to recognize certain colors or emblems, so when they saw the familiar enemy markings, they charged. What the crowd witnessed wasn't just an execution, it was a miniature recreation of Rome's military victories, with the condemned playing the role of Rome's defeated enemies. During the reign of Emperor Claudius in the 1st century CE, these elephant executions made a comeback for special occasions. Condemned criminals were given barely any weapons and forced to face massive elephants that would inevitably crush them. Yet not every execution went according to plan. The writer Aelian tells of one case where an elephant refused to harm a man who had once been its keeper. Instead, the animal trumpeted loudly as if protesting. The crowd, deeply moved by this display of loyalty, shouted for mercy. Claudius, though hesitant, eventually pardoned the man. In a rare twist, an execution meant to showcase Rome's power ended instead with an unexpected act of compassion. Over time, Roman attitudes toward these bloody spectacles shifted. In the early Republic, public executions were meant to show that no one was above the law, and that breaking the social order would bring harsh consequences. But as Rome became an empire, emperors began using these events for more than justice. They used them to display their power and win the crowd's favor. The bigger and more dramatic the show, the more glory the emperor gained. Some emperors, however, pushed this to disturbing extremes. Emperor Commodus, for example, didn't just order elaborate executions, he made himself the star. Styling Himself as Hercules, he strutted into the arena armed with a club and sword, personally killing prisoners in front of massive crowds. The historian Herodian even records that Commodus once ordered every disabled person in Rome to be dragged into the arena. Disguised as Hercules, he then clubbed them to death, turning punishment into his own twisted theater. Justice, power, and vanity all blurred together in these cruel performances. Rome's darkest punishments were often saved for one crime above all: treason. In the shadow of Rome's greatness lay punishments meant to terrify anyone who even thought of betraying the empire. Betrayal wasn't seen as just a crime against a person, it was an attack on Rome itself. The orator Cicero once said, "A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within." This captures how seriously Romans took loyalty. At times, Rome presented itself as noble and generous. For example, in 196 BCE, the consul Titus Quintius Flamininus proclaimed freedom for all Greeks at the Isthmian Games, presenting Rome as a champion of liberty. But the very same civilization that could make such a noble gesture also designed the most terrifying punishments for those who broke trust. Executions weren't just about killing, they were staged as public theater, meant to shock, warn, and command respect. Even Augustus, remembered as the emperor who found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, presided over infamous treason trials, including those of the poet Ovid and his own daughter Julia. By this time, the definition of betraying Rome had expanded so far that even speaking badly of the emperor could be seen as treason. Power had shifted from protecting the republic to protecting the emperor's image. The most dreaded punishment of all was crucifixion. Romans considered it so brutal and humiliating that they usually spared Roman citizens from it. Instead, was reserved for slaves, pirates, enemies of the state, and the most despised criminals. Crucifixion wasn't just death, it was slow suffering, public shame, and the ultimate warning to anyone who dared defy Rome. When someone was sentenced to crucifixion in Rome, the punishment was meant to break both the body and the spirit. First, the condemned person would be stripped of their clothes, whipped without mercy, and forced to carry the heavy wooden beam of their cross through the streets. Imagine the shame of stumbling through crowds, bleeding and exhausted, as people jeered and spat. Once at the execution site, they were tied or nailed to the wood and left hanging in the open air. Death did not come quickly. Most victims suffered for hours, sometimes even days, slowly suffocating as their own weight crushed their lungs. To make it worse, Roman executioners had cruel tricks to drag out the suffering. One was the settle, a small seat fixed to the cross. It gave the victim just enough support to keep them alive longer, stretching the agony from hours into days. The horror of crucifixion became so familiar that the Latin word for cross, crux, turned into a curse word. People would even shout insults like, "Go to the bad cross," their way of saying, "Go to hell." The philosopher Seneca described how Romans even experimented with different methods. Some victims hung upside down, others were nailed through their private parts, while others were stretched out in grotesque positions. One of the most terrifying examples came after Spartacus's slave rebellion in 71 BC, when the Romans finally crushed his army. The general Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered about 6,000 captured rebels to be crucified along the Appian Way, the main road from Rome to Capua. Picture it, a 200-kilometer stretch lined with crosses, each holding a dying man. Travelers walking that road would see thousands of writhing bodies, their suffering carefully prolonged so it could be witnessed by as many people as possible. The message couldn't be clearer. This is what happens to anyone foolish enough to defy Rome. Plutarch later wrote that the corpses were left hanging until they rotted away, their skeletons serving as a grim reminder long after the rebellion had ended. A young Julius Caesar saw this with his own eyes, and he carried that lesson into adulthood. When pirates once kidnapped him, he paid his ransom, But after escaping, he came back with an army, captured them, and had them crucified. Still, he showed a rare mercy. He ordered their throats slit first so they wouldn't suffer as long. But crucifixion was not the only punishment Rome reserved for its enemies. For Romans who betrayed their own people, a different fate waited: the Tarpeian Rock. This was a steep cliff, about 25 meters high, on the southern side of the Capitoline Hill, overlooking the Roman Forum, the very heart of the city. Traitors were hurled from this height, their bodies smashed on the rocks below. The choice of place was no accident. By casting traitors down in front of the Forum, Rome made sure that betrayal was punished in the most public and humiliating way possible. The legend of the rock's name goes back to a girl named Tarpeia, who betrayed Rome to the Sabines in exchange for gold jewelry. But instead of paying her, the Sabines crushed her to death beneath their heavy shields and buried her under them. Fittingly, the first official execution from the cliff was Spurius Cassius, a consul accused of trying to become king in 486 BC. His fall set the pattern. Powerful men who overreached or tried to seize too much power would be cast down from the same hill where they had once sought glory. Even the heroes were not safe. Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, once celebrated for saving Rome from a barbarian invasion, was later accused of wanting to make himself king. For that, in 384 BC, he too was hurled from the Tarpeian Rock. His death was more than just a punishment. It was a warning carved into stone and memory. No matter how great your past deeds, betraying Rome's values meant being thrown from the heart of the city you once defended. Your broken body left as proof that ambition and treachery never went unpunished. When a man was thrown from the Tarpeian Rock, the fall was brutal and final. From the top of that cliff, you could see the temples, government buildings, and the busy Roman Forum below, the very heart of Rome. To die here was more than just an execution. It was a public message. It told everyone watching that no matter how high someone had risen, no matter what battles they had fought for Rome, betraying the state erased everything. Even heroes could fall, and they would fall hard. In 86 BC, Sextus Lucilius, a tribune of the people, met the same fate. Ordered by the powerful general Gaius Marius during the bloody civil wars, he was cast from the rock. Officially, it was punishment for treason, but in truth, it was a political killing disguised as justice. Rome often blurred that line, and the rock was the stage where ambition met its end. Over time, the ground below the cliff became a graveyard. Archaeologists believe so many bodies piled up there that workers had to clear the area regularly. Some ancient writers even say that Emperor Claudius liked to attend these grim spectacles himself. He reportedly studied the corpses afterward, inspecting the twisted limbs and broken bones to see how each man had landed. The philosopher Seneca, horrified, called this kind of behavior cruel even by Roman standards. Still, the Tarpeian Rock remained an active execution site well into the empire, a symbol carved into the city's memory that betrayal would be punished where everyone could see. But Rome's cruelty wasn't limited to traitors. Its soldiers, the very backbone of its power, faced punishments designed to break both body and spirit. One of the most terrifying was called decimation. The word comes from the Latin decimus, meaning 1 in 10. Whenever a legion was guilty of cowardice, rebellion, or serious failure, it could be sentenced to this punishment. Imagine the fear. The men were divided into groups of 10, and each group drew lots. The unlucky one who picked the short stick knew his fate. His 9 closest brothers in arms had to turn on him, beating him to death with clubs or stones. The punishment didn't end with death. The survivors were shamed too. They were forced to sleep outside the safety of the camp, exposed to the cold, and they were fed barley instead of wheat animal feed, instead of proper rations. For professional soldiers, this was humiliating. A centurion named Titus Pullo once said that a soldier who witnessed decimation never needed a second lesson. The horror of that lottery of death was burned into his memory forever. Some men even killed themselves rather than participate, while others swore blood oaths with their friends, promising that if one of them drew the fatal lot, the others would not survive either. Yet strangely, decimation often had the effect the Romans wanted. Soldiers who survived were driven by shame and fear to fight with unmatched fury. One legion, the Legio III Augusta, was decimated for poor performance in North Africa. But later, determined to erase its disgrace, it fought so ferociously that under Emperor Septimius Severus, it earned the proud nickname, the Emperor's Hammer. The punishment was both clever and cruel. It spread terror evenly because every man had a 1 in 10 chance of death. No one could feel safe. And by forcing soldiers to kill one of their own, it destroyed the idea of unity and made every survivor complicit in the crime. No one could claim innocence, and no one could easily rebel again. The poet Lucan later described it with chilling words. In decimation, fate was left to chance, and death came not by justice, but by the draw of a lot. This practice appeared throughout Roman history. In 71 BC, the same year Spartacus was finally defeated, Marcus Licinius Crassus used decimation against his own troops after they disobeyed orders and suffered defeat. About 500 men died that day, not at the hands of the enemy, but under the clubs of their fellow Romans. Centuries later, in 17 AD, the general Germanicus threatened decimation to silence a mutiny among his men on the Rhine frontier. He later changed his mind, choosing to punish only the leaders, but the threat alone was enough to break the rebellion. Even during the chaotic 3rd century, emperors like Gallienus revived the threat of decimation, showing that the Romans never forgot its power. Both the Tarpeian Rock and decimation carried the same brutal message. Rome demanded absolute loyalty. Betray the state, betray your general, or even hesitate in battle, and the punishment would be not just death, but death in a way designed to terrify everyone who saw it. To fall from the cliff in the city center was to be cast out of Rome itself. To die in decimation was to be destroyed by the hands of your own brothers. Rome ruled not only through military might, but through fear carved into the bones of its people. The Romans had many harsh punishments, but one of the most terrifying wasn't about pain or death. It was about being forgotten. They called it damnatio memoria, which means condemnation of memory. To the Romans, this was worse than execution, because it erased everything a person had ever been. In a society where honor, reputation, and family name were everything, being erased from history was the ultimate punishment. Imagine this. Statues of the condemned person were smashed to pieces, or their heads were chiseled away and replaced with another man's face. Their names were scratched off monuments so that even future generations would never know they existed. Their coins were melted down, their wills canceled, and their families often ruined. Sometimes it even became illegal to say their names out loud, as if speaking them could bring back their presence. For a Roman who hoped to live on forever through glory and memory, this was a fate worse than death. The poet Horace once wrote, "I shall not wholly die," expressing his hope that his writings would keep him alive forever. But damnatio memoria was built to kill that hope completely. During times of political turmoil, this punishment became almost routine. Sculptors even got clever about it, creating statues with removable heads, knowing that today's hero might become tomorrow's traitor. One of the most famous victims was Emperor Domitian, assassinated in 96 CE. The Senate despised him so much that the moment he was dead, they ordered his statues destroyed, his name erased, and even buildings connected to him torn down. Historian Suetonius wrote that the Senate was actually overjoyed at his death, and they rushed to erase him from the world as if he had never been emperor at all. Another emperor, Commodus, who was notorious for his wild behavior and obsession with presenting himself as a god, also suffered this punishment. His statues were torn down after his assassination in 192 CE, but unlike Domitian, his memory didn't stay condemned forever. His successor, Septimius Severus, later reversed the judgment and even declared him divine. This showed how unstable and political the whole process really was. One day you were erased, the next you could be worshipped as a god. But perhaps the most chilling example was Sejanus, the powerful Praetorian prefect under Emperor Tiberius. At one point, it looked like he might take control of Rome itself. When he fell from favor, the reaction was brutal. His statues were pulled down and melted, his name scraped off every inscription, and his entire family was killed so no one could carry on his bloodline. Tacitus, the historian, records a heartbreaking detail. Sejanus's young daughter, far too young to even understand what was happening, was dragged to her execution. She begged her captors, "What have I done? I won't do it again," thinking she was being punished for some childish mistake. That single cry captures the cruelty of Rome's punishments. Her only crime was being born into the wrong family. The irony of damnatio memoria is that it never truly worked. The very act of erasing someone made them unforgettable. People remembered them not for their deeds, but for the strange emptiness they left behind, the missing name on a monument, the broken face of a statue, the blank space in Rome's history. It was a ghostly reminder of how fragile power was, and how quickly glory could turn to dust. Even centuries later, we know about these people because the Romans worked so hard to destroy them. Their absence became louder than their presence, and their punishment, meant to erase them, instead made them eternal in a different, darker way. The Romans are remembered for their beautiful temples, mighty roads, and wise philosophers, but behind all that glory was a darker truth. They were willing to use shocking violence to protect their empire from anyone who dared to betray it. Their punishments were not just about ending a life. They were carefully staged performances meant to frighten the people and remind everyone what happened if you broke Rome's trust. Emperor Constantine himself once executed his own son for suspected treason, saying it was better to lose one citizen than let betrayal poison the soul of Rome. That tells you how seriously they took loyalty. To the Romans, justice had to reflect the crime, so every punishment carried deep symbolism. And while crucifixion or throwing people to wild animals are the punishments we usually hear about, Rome's law codes held punishments that were even stranger and far more horrifying. The most shocking of all was the punishment of the sack reserved for parricide, the murder of one's own parents. In Roman culture, killing your father or mother wasn't just a crime, it was the worst possible. Betrayal. It broke pietas, the sacred duty a child owed to their family, their ancestors, and by extension, Rome itself. To commit such a sin was to cut yourself off from everything that tied you to society, to life, and even to the gods. And so the punishment was designed to strip you of everything, air, earth, water, and sunlight, so that you no longer had any place in the natural world. The ritual was carried out with chilling detail. First, the guilty man was beaten with blood-red rods, as if to mark his shame for all to see. Then, he was sewn tightly into a leather sack. But he wasn't placed there alone. Inside the sack were 4 live animals: a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a snake. Each animal carried a meaning, turning the sack into a twisted stage play of the murderer's guilt. The dog stood for shamelessness, the rooster for arrogance, the monkey for wickedness, and the snake for poisonous hatred. Together they created a grotesque company, thrashing and snapping inside the cramped sack, biting at the criminal and at each other. Finally, the sack was tied shut and thrown into the Tiber River or out to sea. The criminal was drowned, beaten, and bitten at once, unable to escape, denied burial, denied sunlight, and denied even the dignity of being remembered. This punishment had ancient roots. It appeared in Rome's earliest known legal code, the 12 Tables, showing that from the very beginning, Rome saw parricide as a crime beyond forgiveness. But it wasn't always carried out regularly. In fact, by 101 BC, when Publius Malleolus murdered his own mother, the ritual had fallen out of use for so long that officials had to research the old customs just to know how to perform it again. That case marked the first official use of the sack under the Republic, and it left a deep scar on Roman memory. Later, Augustus, Rome's first emperor, revived the punishment during his moral reforms, hoping to scare people back into living by Rome's family values. Even Emperor Claudius is said to have watched one of these executions, moved by its grim symbolism. The act was not just about killing a criminal. It was about sending a terrifying message. If you turn against the ones who gave you life, you lose the right to exist in the world they gave you. There are chilling stories connected to this punishment. One tale comes from the 2nd century CE, when a condemned man actually laughed as he was prepared for the sack. Shocked, the officials asked why he found humor in such a fate. The man answered calmly, "Because today I will achieve what philosophers chase all their lives to experience all the elements at once." It was a clever and even bold answer, but it did nothing to save him. He was executed as planned, his body thrown into the river at the Sestian Bridge, one of the traditional places for carrying out the ritual. His joke, if anything, made the punishment seem even more terrifying, because it showed how fully he had accepted his doom. For the Romans, this brutal practice revealed something essential about their idea of justice. They believed punishment should mirror the crime, like a reflection in a dark mirror. Cicero, the famous orator, explained it simply: someone who kills the person who gave them life deserves to be cut off from every source of life itself. No sky to look at, no sun to warm them, no water to refresh them, no earth to rest their body. It was cruel, yes, but to Roman minds it was also poetic. And that was Rome, brilliant and terrible all at once. Behind the beauty of the Pantheon and the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius stood a people who believed fear, pain, and spectacle were just as powerful tools of empire as marble, law, and philosophy. The Romans were known for their discipline, their laws, and their mighty empire. But when it came to punishment, they also created some of the most terrifying and cruel methods ever imagined. One of the most famous was called the Pona Kale, or the punishment of the sack. This was reserved for one of the worst crimes in Roman society: killing your own father or mother. Family was sacred to the Romans, and to harm your parents was seen as not just a crime against them, but against the gods, the ancestors, and the very order of the world. The punishment was designed to show this betrayal in the most horrifying way possible. Instead of being honored with a proper burial and joining their ancestors in the afterlife, the guilty person would be sewn into a large leather sack along with live animals. At first, the sack only contained snakes, but as time went on, the Romans added other creatures: dogs, monkeys, and even chickens. The idea was that the criminal, who had destroyed the sacred bonds of family, would now be forced into a twisted, nightmarish family of beasts. Imagine the terror of being trapped in total darkness, the sack pressing tightly around you, with angry animals clawing, biting, and thrashing inside. You couldn't escape, and instead of resting peacefully in death, you were cursed to struggle among creatures that symbolized your shame. Not every case was treated the same, though. Emperor Hadrian, one of Rome's more thoughtful rulers, sometimes gave a lighter punishment if the killing had special circumstances. In these cases, the criminal was simply drowned in the sea without any animals, still denied an honorable death, but spared the horror of the sack. In different parts of the empire, the animals inside the sack were changed depending on what was available. Where monkeys were rare, wolves or bears were used instead, but the meaning was always the same. You had betrayed your family, so now you would die with wild beasts. While this punishment grew out of Roman law and religion, the Romans also borrowed cruel ideas from other cultures. One of the most horrifying was called scaphism, also known as the boats. This came originally from Persia, but the Romans adopted it and made it part of their own system of punishment, especially in the eastern provinces where Persian influence was strong. The process was slow, painful, and almost unthinkable. The condemned person was stripped of their clothes and forced between two boats or hollowed-out logs placed one on top of the other. Their head, arms, and legs stuck out, but the rest of their body was trapped inside. Then, the victim was force-fed milk and honey until their stomach could take no more, causing violent diarrhea inside the boat. Their skin was also smeared with honey, especially on the face, to attract flies and other insects. The person was then left floating in a swamp or pond, unable to move, covered in their own waste, while swarms of insects crawled over them, stinging, biting, and slowly eating them alive. This wasn't a quick death. It could take days or even weeks. The Roman historian Plutarch described one man, a soldier named Mithridates, who suffered this fate and somehow clung to life for 17 days before death finally released him. The body, bloated and rotting while still alive, became a breeding ground for worms and insects. The smell alone would have been unbearable. The Romans used this punishment sparingly, only for crimes they considered to endanger the entire community, betraying military secrets, desecrating holy places, or acts of deep treachery. But the very mention of scaphism was enough to break people. Vegetius, a Roman military writer, said that soldiers would confess to spying or desertion just by hearing the punishment described. It was terror turned into a weapon. Even powerful figures were frightened by the threat of it. In 270 CE, when Emperor Aurelian captured Queen Zenobia of Palmyra after her failed rebellion, he threatened her with scaphism. Zenobia was known for her pride and courage, but when she heard what awaited her, she gave in at once, choosing exile in Rome over such a fate. There are also stories of scaphism being twisted into even more brutal forms. During the persecution of Christians in the 3rd century, a deacon named Sanctus of Carthage was said to have endured a version, where his body was not only smeared with honey, but also burned with hot metal plates. Imagine the torment of fire and insects together, flesh blistering and crawling with bugs. Yet Sanctus never broke. Through all of it, he answered every question with the same calm words, "I am a Christian." His strength unsettled his torturers, so much that they finally abandoned the slow death and ended his life quickly with a sword. Roman thinkers like Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, explained why punishments like this existed. It wasn't only about ending a person's life. It was about making the punishment last, stretching it out so the suffering itself became the lesson. In his writings on anger, Seneca said that sometimes punishment was more about satisfying rage than about serving justice. Scaphism was the extreme form of this idea, an execution so drawn out and horrific that it acted as both punishment and warning. The Romans also had other punishments built on the same principle. Fire, for example, was seen as both a purifier and a destroyer. One method, called mors per ignem, or death by fire, involved burning someone slowly, not in a quick blaze, but in a way that maximized pain. To the Romans, this slow suffering matched the seriousness of certain crimes, especially those against the gods or the empire itself. In the end, punishments like the sack, scaphism, and slow fire reveal a dark side of Roman power. They believed that some crimes demanded more than just death. They required terror, pain, and humiliation. Whether in a sack with beasts, trapped between boats swarming with insects, or tied to the flames, the criminal's suffering became a warning to everyone else. Some boundaries could never be crossed without paying the highest, most dreadful price. Unlike quick executions by burning at the stake, which could sometimes end life within minutes, The Romans often went out of their way to make punishments with fire as long and painful as possible. They carefully controlled the flame so the heat would roast the body slowly, not kill instantly. Sometimes the condemned were locked inside a hollow bronze bowl, a terrible invention taken from the Greeks, and placed over a low fire so that they roasted alive while their screams echoed through the metal like the roar of a beast. Other times, the victims were laid out on a heated metal grate called a criticular or even lowered partway into boiling oil, their skin blistering and peeling as the crowd watched. The playwright Plautus even joked about this cruelty in his comedy. The prisoners, where a cook is threatened with being roasted more slowly than a duck in a cold oven. This dark humor shows how normal these punishments had become in Roman culture. One of the most chilling examples took place in 177 CE in the Roman colony of Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, France, where the young Christian martyr Blandina was tied to an iron chair and roasted over controlled flames as part of the public games. Witnesses claimed she remained conscious for much of the ordeal, speaking calmly even as her flesh burned. To the Romans, fire was not just a weapon, it had sacred meaning. Fire belonged to the goddess Vesta, guardian of the hearth, and to Vulcan, god of the forge. Using fire to punish criminals was seen as a way to purify their crimes, burning away the pollution they had brought upon the community. But as Rome shifted from a republic into a mighty empire, these punishments became less about sacred ritual and more about bloody entertainment for the masses. Executions by fire were staged like theater, with the suffering of the condemned turned into a public spectacle. The jurist Ulpian, writing in the early 3rd century CE, even called death by fire supreme punishment and suggested it for the worst offenders, arsonists, poisoners, and sorcerers. During the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a false prophet named Alexander, who had stirred up riots, was sentenced to a horrific death in the Roman Forum. He was strapped to a metal chair, which was slowly heated until it glowed red, roasting him alive. While a crowd of spectators looked on, hearing every scream and watching every agonizing movement as his body writhed against the iron. Perhaps even more terrifying than fire was another punishment known as the Collegium Tenebrarum, or College of Shadows, the practice of live burial. This was most famously used on the Vestal Virgins, the sacred priestesses sworn to remain pure and celibate for 30 years. If a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, she could not be whipped or executed like an ordinary person, because she was considered holy and untouchable. Instead, the Romans created a cruel loophole. The condemned Vestal was dressed in funeral clothes and carried in a closed litter, as if already a corpse, to a desolate place outside the city called the Campus Celeratus, the Field of Sign. There, a small underground chamber awaited, prepared with a bed, a lamp, some food, and a little water. By giving her these supplies, the Romans claimed they were not killing her directly, but leaving her to die naturally. In truth, it was a slow, suffocating death by starvation, thirst, and darkness. Archaeologists have uncovered such chambers near Rome's Colline Gate, finding oil lamps, pottery fragments, and even skeletal remains that match these grim accounts. Once sealed inside, the Vestal was utterly alone, her only choices being to let starvation take her slowly, or to end her own suffering more quickly. One of the most famous victims was Cornelia, the chief Vestal Virgin, who was condemned in 91 CE by Emperor Domitian, even though many believed her innocent. As she was led to her underground tomb, the crowd watched in silence. Plutarch tells us that when her funeral dress caught on the ladder leading down, the executioner reached out a hand to help her, but Cornelia pulled away, refusing to be touched, keeping her dignity until the very last moment. She descended into the chamber with calm resolve, showing no outward fear. Pliny the Younger, who saw the grim procession, later wrote bitterly that no real proof had ever been given for her guilt, only the emperor's word. For the Romans, this strange legal fiction allowed them to punish a holy woman without technically spilling her blood. For Cornelia and others like her, however, it meant being buried alive in silence and darkness, erased from the world above, while Rome convinced itself that justice had been done. As Cornelia was led to her fate, she kept calling out to Vesta and the other gods, repeating the same bitter words over and over. "Caesar believes I am impure. I who carried out the sacred rites while he celebrated his victories and ruled." Her calm defiance only made the moment more haunting. What made live burial so terrifying was not just the pain but the slow, crushing realization of what it meant. Other punishments, however cruel, at least brought death eventually. But being sealed underground was a horror of its own kind, trapped in complete darkness, knowing there was no way out and feeling every breath grow shorter as the air slowly ran out. The Roman philosopher Lucretius once wrote that the deepest fear of all humans is the darkness of death itself, and the Romans used this fear like a weapon. It wasn't only the Vestal virgins who faced this fate. After the failed plot of Lucius Sergius Catilina in 63 BC, some of his followers were strangled in the Tullianum prison, but others were said to have been buried alive in chambers built beneath the prison floor. Historian Sallust wrote that these rooms, called the Little Tullianums, were so small a man could only stand upright, unable even to lie down while waiting for death. Imagine the helplessness of standing for hours, then days, in pitch darkness, slowly starving and suffocating, with no hope of escape. As we reach the end of this journey into Rome's darkest punishments, it becomes clear that their justice was often less about fairness and more about fear. Seneca the Younger once said, "The man who makes punishment his trade takes pleasure not in having punished, but in punishing." That line may reveal Rome's darkest truth. These elaborate punishments were not just about law, they were about control, spectacle, and power. Even now, when you walk the ruins of the Forum or see the blank spaces on ancient inscriptions where condemned names were erased, you can still feel the echoes of that cruelty. It is a reminder that punishment has always been tied not only to justice but to the struggle between fear, power, and memory. Until we meet again, farewell.